my first step ever podcast, and I am Ishani Nigam, your host and producer of the podcast. This podcast is made for all the disruptors around the globe who know that they are made for something, for that one thing, but fear of embarrassment, fear of rejection, the fear of fear itself holds us back at some point in time. But hey, those are the only milestones that if we cross, we are there to take our first steps. So, welcome on this journey with me where I interview people from across the globe so that they can share their story, their challenges, and you know that even you can surpass yours. Well, what are you waiting for? Let's get started. Welcome on my first step ever. We are somewhere nearing more than 100 plus, 110 plus episodes, but the world never ceases to surprise us with unique stories and unique personalities and people who have really made it into their life and they're still pursuing their goals, making themselves better each day. Now, I have someone extremely special today, and I'm so honored that she is over here with us. She is Michelle Akhidenor, all the way from Australia. Hi, Michelle. How are you doing?
I'm so well, Ashani. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. And I think people who are listening to us from Australia, even from across the globe in the US, would definitely know who we are talking to today and who we are listening to, because I think you have definitely earned a very good name for yourself. And the way you have built your company, your dream, your story is something I think worth sharing with the youth, and also for the people who are starting the second innings in their life who do listen to this podcast and they really get inspired. But over here in this podcast, we really kind of discuss behind the scenes of the first step that a person takes, because I think that's the most difficult and you need a lot of courage to take the first step, and that's where the magic lies. So before I begin to kind of sort of unpack and discover your story, I like to give a little bit of background about you to our listeners today. So Michelle is an entrepreneur and a marketer. She's the founder and the chief executive officer of the Peers Project, Australia's only BIPOC female led podcast agency. And Michelle launched the Peers Project in 2018. And since then, it has only skyrocketed with the bootstrapped and scaled the company to even seven figures in revenue, bringing on Fortune 500s and venture startups as clients, including Alibaba Group, Indie.com, Shopify, Visa, and a lot more over there. Now, I would like to kind of sort of make sort of an announcement if people are not really aware that we have Michelle, who is also the winner of, and she has been bestowed with the award Forbes 30 Under 30. And that is incredible because it means that there is a lot in store for us to learn from her mindset and what really made her that she is today. So her business, her project is actually being showcased on very different and very reputable platforms all across Australia and even abroad. For example, she is also recognized as a 7 News Young Achievers Award finalist in 2023 she became BNT's 30 under 30 entrepreneur of the year. Now there's lots of achievements and accolades that she has achieved in such a young age. I would say, I think you're still going strong and you have lots more to do. So I think I'll begin with my first question that I'm very, very excited to ask. Michelle, take us through your childhood, your upbringing. What were you surrounded with and who were you surrounded with? What was your mindset back then?
Great question. Firstly, Ashani, sometimes I get a bit overwhelmed when, someone so lovely like yourself reads all the things. But, I think at the end of the day, it's just, all the accolades are so beautiful, but I think the journey is really just so interesting and so many ups and downs. And I'm so grateful for the achievements. But, they always say the ones who potentially have achieved a little bit in their lives are the ones who have failed the most. And that's definitely myself. So, if I take us back to Michelle, the early years, it's so funny because I also run my own podcast and I actually ask a very similar question at the beginning. I think I was actually quite a quiet kid. I was really kept to myself. I was quietly spoken, which is a bit strange now because I speak for a living. But I think back then, I was surrounded by my family. I grew up in Melbourne, here in Australia. My parents are immigrants, and I grew up with my two sisters, and we were all just kind of told that, we have such a great opportunity here in Oz to make something of ourselves. And I think I always remember being told that I could do anything and be anyone. And so I really carried that through. I remember the first quote unquote achievement I had as a 5-year-old was, class captain at
Oh,
my,
wow.
school. And I think that idea around achievement was always instilled in us to
Mm.
just persevere, to just try and make something of ourselves. And it's really stuck through for me, as I grew up.
This is incredible. I think actually it's quite the contradictory also, I feel, and in a way quite intriguing because as you mentioned that you were a pretty quiet person, while you were growing up. Very different from what you are today. But I'm sure that you had those qualities that were sort of identified early on, and that's why you were bestowed with the I mean the title of class captain at the age of 5, if I'm not wrong. I really want to kind of, take this thing forward over here from you, like when you were growing up and when you started getting that responsibility of being in that position where you maybe had to, help certain people over there in certain way. Being a captain, there's a lot of responsibility even at that age. And probably having that from very early on sometimes sort of changes our outlook for things as well. I'm really interested to know from that time onwards, how was your journey up till like teens, and what really made you change the way you are or the way you think, if it really did, or how it was for you? Because I think the people who are listening to us, they definitely are in the early 20s, late 20s, but there is a certain amount of things that we go through in our childhood that really impact us even when we grow up. And having to listen to your story and how you perceive things would make us understand a lot about how do you kind of see yourself and how you would like to kind of identify or not identify with things that you liked or did not like in the childhood.
I think it's really interesting, as we grow up, all of the things that we, as you mentioned, Ashani, so beautifully, that all of the things that we learn as a child really stick with us. And I think it's those pivotal years really early on that kind of shape who we become and how we see the world. And sometimes not in the best way either. I do have a therapist and she's great, because I think a lot of that for me, that achievement piece was always so strong, and it was tied
Mhm.
to my self-worth, and it still to this day, it's something I'm working through, that feeling of when I was growing up in heading into my teens of, if I don't achieve, if I'm not school captain or class captain, or if I don't get, good grades, then, am I even worthy? And that's a really scary thing to think about, when we attach our self-worth to these accolades, which are so, don't get me wrong, they're great. And, but I think for me, as I grew up, it was, and this more so happened as I entered my 20s, but it was more so understanding how the role of achievement and being praised for the achievement impacted how I saw myself, and almost the way yeah, as you mentioned, identified. So that has been something that was really interesting to kind of notice heading into, I guess, my 20s and when I started my business. But, my teenage years were just hustle, 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 do every sport, every music activity, everything really. I was fortunate enough to travel abroad quite a bit when I was growing up. I studied overseas quite a bit, learning my languages, and I always loved different cultures and understanding new things. But, I think when I look back, I'm so grateful for all the opportunity. I'm also so mindful of how the achievement or desire to achieve, shaped me, and kind of in so many ways helped and hindered me along the way.
I think this is incredible the way that you have genuinely sort of explained how things really work out for us while we are growing up, and then when we grow up, how we look things at once we are able to reflect and understand. And it's a very important point that you have mentioned over here, is the things that we associate with, we sort of associate our self-worth with. It becomes really challenging if we are associating it with some negative things that has happened, and some challenges that we have gone through, and we have not really kind of spoken about it with our peers or our family. And the good things also, that we attach to, associate with, that always kind of stays in our mind. And also, like, I really want to appreciate you over here, sort of voicing out that when you need some sort of sort of help, and you want to communicate, we need to kind of look out for that help. And it's great that you're mentioning it, that we do need that help in the form of a therapist or a friend or any sort of formal communication. It's very important, because you have only one life, and if you're able to understand that, if you that there is a help required, where you can extract the best out of what was in your past, and how to kind of deal with what did not work out for you, it is the time, and you must take that time to do that. But I think this brings me to the next question, which is, while you were in your 20s, and when you had already had a great experience so far, traveling, learning new languages, I think you were very open to welcoming different culture, languages, and people. How did that sort of shape you in your 20s, and how did you start trickling down into this business side? I'm very interested to know.
You know what I love? I've always loved travel. I've always loved different cultures. I think being biracial, I grew up this way, I both my parents, my mom's white, my dad's black, and they came from different heritages and backgrounds. And I think, growing up as someone who is biracial and, who is a person of color, you just grow to kind of really appreciate different cultures and how different ways of being. And as I mentioned, I was so fortunate to do extensive travel in Asia as I grew up. Being, Aussie based, Australia based is just the closest place to go. My parents would take us on family holidays every summer. And, I'm so grateful because I got to really see, especially in Asia, the way people live in other parts of the world. And, that's not so dissimilar to other, third world nations like Africa or, wherever else. And it really just opened my eyes to the fact that we have it so well here. And, it just made me so curious to learn more about the world. And, I did a stint in China. I studied Mandarin when I was growing up and
Wow.
through to university. And so I did a stint in China when I was maybe like 20 or 21. And I remember studying there and, just being so immersed in that culture that was so different to anything I'd ever experienced. I often say that, it was that experience in China and learning such a difficult language and, being in a place where no one really on the street spoke English, no one did. It was just figure it out and just, learn your Chinese and try and speak it. Otherwise, you won't be able to catch your Uber. People don't understand, when you take a taxi and things like that. So
Mm.
I think it was that experience. And I always say this, that gave me, I guess, the understanding and the grit of what it takes to be an entrepreneur and to start something from scratch. I also studied business and, did a stint in the UK and that was lovely. And business education is great,
Yeah.
but nothing can prepare you for the
Life.
journey that is life and entrepreneurship and starting a business. It's always really interesting. They say, go and study this and you'll be prepared for starting a business or the journey of entrepreneurship. And, as I alluded to before, for me, it was really my time studying foreign languages. And, in particularly when I was studying in China, I studied Mandarin there for about 6 months, or maybe just shy of that. But it was a stint that I did there. And, it really just kind of opened my eyes to the fact that no matter how prepared you think you are, or, how many years you've dedicated and studied and worked to understand something, you really are just kind of starting from scratch. And that's how I felt being in China. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity and experience, but it was super daunting. And I think it's being able to overcome, being able to just learn to communicate in that language on the ground there was a feat that I don't even know how I got through, but it reminds me so much of business. And, when you think about starting a business, everything that's so foreign to you, all of the things that are so confusing in the early days, for me, it was the grit I developed learning Chinese and being over in China that really, I guess, set me up, quote unquote, for what the business journey would be like. Well, I don't know if anything could prepare you for that, but to the best that it could.
That's really exciting to know, Michelle. That what you're kind of sharing with us today is that how I think that's how life really is. And if you're able to kind of learn that early on and, develop that grit that you did, that really translates into your life, your career going forward. And that we can see right now. And as you say that was somewhere the basis of, what you are today in terms of in the entrepreneurship business that you're in. And often you've heard people say this is a place where you don't know what's coming next. I mean, you can garner the experience, but every time you're thrown with a different experience and you have to kind of adapt. So I really want to kind of know over here that, you mentioned that the more accolades that you have, it means the more you have failed, something that you mentioned quite early on. I would like to kind of marry these questions over here. If you can take us through the early stage of your entrepreneurship days, first thing I wanted to know in that, how did you really convince yourself, or how did you really talk to yourself and say, I have to start? Like, there is no back and forth happening now, and this is where I want to be, and I have to take this leap. And if you could take us through your probably top one or two failures of how did you really, come about to the situation that you're right now?
Wow, it takes me back. It's about 6 years ago now since I started on this journey. And I think, how did it start? Wow. I mean, look, I was in a place where I had done a lot of travel. I was really grateful. I was in my final year of studies, and I just was not super excited about the path I was on. As I mentioned, I studied business, and then I went out to work in finance in my final year, and I was just not excited. I wasn't excited about the day to day. I was looking at, the partners above me and everyone who had climbed that ladder, and I just really wasn't motivated by it. And I think for me, as we've talked about growing up, there was always that next thing. It was always what's next and how can we get to the next step? And for me, I honestly just thought, is this it? Is this what I've worked so hard for to, be sat in a job potentially that I just don't really enjoy? And it got quite severe, this feeling of, I feel really confused and like this path isn't for me, but I have no idea what is. And I think, the way I grew up, as much as my both my parents are entrepreneurs, and they run a very successful company for the last 30 years together. So I
Amazing.
had that vision of them. I saw that, but I thought like, oh, business is when you're like 40 or you're older and you're like, my parents, and you just start a business and you do that. But I never thought it was possible to kind of start at 23. And so for me, it was really a journey of self-discovery where it all started from, I just want to sit down and chat to people who actually enjoy what they do. And I wasn't seeing that on the corporate path I was on. So I just kind of thought, stuff it. I'll just meet some people, I'll have a chat with them, and I will understand hopefully how they're doing things that they're passionate about. And for me, that person that I wanted to meet was someone who was young, who was like me, super passionate, but who had created something of their own, so their own business. I didn't even understand back then. I didn't understand what the word entrepreneurship meant. I had no idea what that even meant. I was like, what? Couldn't even pronounce the word entrepreneur. I was like, that sounds a bit strange to me. And at the time, this was kind of 2016, 2017, where although this idea of startups was a thing, it was nowhere near as prevalent as it is today. This idea of side hustle didn't exist back then. No one talked about it. And so, for me, and the idea of startup for me at the time was, oh, you're a tech nerd. Like you understand tech. I was terrible at tech. I was like, how could I possibly, even understand this? But long story short, that just desire and frustration to just figure out what I wanted to do and hopefully end up doing something I was passionate about. It led me to start these conversations. And I remember I was chatting with a girlfriend about this idea of, you know what, I'm just going to try and find these young people. They call them entrepreneurs, who are really passionate about what they do. And I'm just going to ask them how they did it. And she was also sitting there being like, you know what, I also feel so just alienated in where I'm at with my job, and I don't feel very passionate about it. I don't even know if I like my job. So I was chatting with a girlfriend and I told her about, the fact that I want to chat with these people. And she said, oh my goodness, I want to hear these conversations that you're having. And so that's when I decided back in 2017 to start my own podcast. And so I ended up starting my podcast, which at the time was called the Peers Project. And the Peers Project was just my creative passion project. I ended up in my final year deciding to start it. And when I decided to do something, I just couldn't go, 50% of the way. I had to go 100% in. So I thought, stuff it, I'm going to find the biggest and the best young entrepreneurs, those who are on the, the Forbes and the 30 list, whatever that means. And I'm going to sit down and chat with them. And so that's literally what happened. I ended up quitting my job. I ended up going to New York and I ended up starting this podcast, which at the time was called the Peers Project, as I mentioned. And I sat down with maybe 20 or 30 entrepreneurs in a period of about 14 days when I was in New York. And I couldn't even believe these people wanted to chat with me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, the fact that they had started these businesses from scratch and were just so aligned with them. After that time in New York and running this show, and I kept it going, I kept it going when I went to London and I came back to Australia. I kept having these interviews. I just became so inspired to start something of my own. And podcast guests that gave me that nudge or that push and that passion to go at my own and start my own business.
So thank you so much, Michelle, for, kind of taking us through your very honest journey of how it all began with just for the need of, kind of trying to really do what you want to do. And I think it's a very important thing, like when you have a feeling of that sorts, that that where you're going is not the right path for you, and you really take it on you to make things work. And that's very important. So thank you so much for taking us through your journey from the childhood, what really formed your thinking back then, what really pushed you forward, or what, and in the journey that you had so far, what really helped lay that foundation for your amazing business that you have right now, which is the Peers Project. And you cover so many amazing stories. I had a quick question, and probably we'll round it up with a quote that you would like to share. The question is regarding any top 3 tips that you can give to our listeners in regards to failures that you have faced.
Sure. So the first one is your failures don't define you. They feel really shitty in the moment, but they're not the be all and end all. Secondly, failure leads to success. And honestly, it's just how you see it. I went through 5 failed business models after launching my podcast and trying to figure out what my actual business was going to be. And, now I run a podcast production agency, which is very different to the first iteration of my business. And so, failure just leads to you figuring out what that successful outcome is going to be. And then thirdly and finally, if you don't try, you'll never know, so just try and, get knocked down, get back up again, just keep going. As long as it aligns to what you care about, what you're passionate about, and just feels good when you do it, that it will ultimately bring you a level of fulfillment that you never even thought possible.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. It was really lovely to know your journey. And I would really always request our guest speakers to leave our listeners with a quote or saying that they really resonate with.
Tomorrow is another day. It's something that my
Lovely.
dad used to say every morning, or every night, sorry, after a big day of work. And it's just something that's stuck by me throughout this journey. There's always tomorrow. Tomorrow is another day.
That's great. That is so deep, meaningful, yet a very, very simple policy to follow if you know what it really means. So thank you so much, Michelle, for being on my first step ever. It is always so great to, add on to our own knowledge and a perspective with a new and fresh perspective, the way you have lived your life, the way you see challenges, mistakes, failures, and how you openly welcome, new experiences in your life, and how you rope in all the learnings and transfer it into what you're doing today. And I think one key takeaway for me from this episode was that the more you're successful, the more you have failed. This was really, really interesting. So thank you so much for taking us through that journey.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
If you're still glued together on this episode, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And if you really want to hear more such stories from around the globe, then subscribe to my First Step Ever podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify, whichever platform you prefer. Please do give ratings and please do write your comments. And you can directly reach out to me on my First Step Ever _IN. That's my Instagram handle. A little about myself. I have always loved performing on stage, acting, speaking, and just emoting myself. So I use these medium different ways so that I can connect with people, help them, empower them, infotain them, which is to inform them and entertain them. If you would like to collaborate for any opportunities, more than welcome to connect with me on my Instagram handle. Thank you.